I believe that it matters not just what we do and even more than the popular why we do it. I think both of those are important, but I think what often gets overlooked is how we do it. And I am particularly interested in this question as it relates to creativity and how we work. Many of us are good at the what. We get really good at what we do. And the past few years have had a lot of information and emphasis on the why of what we're doing, which is important. So many of us may have a robust understanding of why we're doing something, the big purpose behind it. But what I find the most with folks when, especially when we're working on things like workflows and systems, et cetera, is that where we struggle often now is often on how we're doing it. If the how is not aligned or it isn't working, then that's where we end up burned out, resentful, overworked, overwhelmed, even if we love what we do and even if we understand why we do it. So the how is actually really important in order for both of those to manifest. So I've definitely learned this lesson in some of the hardest ways possible as it relates to work and my work. So I'm a very devoted student to this question of how. And it's a lot of what I help folks do inside of system sessions. Again, when we're talking about workflows or creative project management or building out our digital spaces, is to support the how of the work so that the what and the why can be more shiny and come more forward. So it's not just enough that something gets done. It matters how it gets done. So how it gets done determines our longevity, it determines our sustainability, and it also determines the quality of our outcomes, which is to say it determines our true impact. How is a very holistic question. So I'm curious, how does the how relate to your work? Where are you feeling tension around how something is getting done? Is that something that you're working with right now? Maybe you feel totally aligned around it, or maybe you feel some friction or some tension. So if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below this video. I'd love to know. And if you're listening on the podcast, let me know in an email or a review. So my ongoing question of how we work is and how we create and just getting into the how of the process led me to a book called Shorter by Alex Sujong Kim Pung. And it's a book all about 4-day work weeks, how organizations are shifting towards them, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and what are some of the benefits of shortening working hours in the first place. As he says in the book, in this project, he's focusing on companies that have done 3 things at the same time. 1, they've shortened their total working hours. 2, they've kept salaries the same. And 3, they've maintained the same levels of productivity, profitability, and customer service. So I don't know about you, but the first time I heard that, I was thinking, what? Like you work fewer hours, but you get paid the same? Like this is like a corporate thing? And my mind was personally blown when I first considered that on a high organizational level. But as you work your way through the book, not only does that proposition become really tangible, it arguably becomes the obvious choice. And it makes us question instead, why aren't we already doing this? So while the book goes into greater detail into, bringing this design thinking into the 4-day work week and more detail into how different organizations have trialed this experiment and made it work for them, I'm not going to go so in the weeds here. If you want that level of detail, you can find it in the book, and I have a link to that in the link below. In this video, I'll focus more on a summary of some of 3 of the main themes that really jumped out at me in the book, including, the problem that the 4-day work week can help solve, and then what are some of the changes that make a 4-day work week more possible. And those include seeing focus as something that is social and not individual, and then also emphasizing the quality of hours over the quantity of hours, and then everyone taking ownership of their work. So I'll go into more of these in a few minutes, but for now, let's go ahead and jump into the problem. So it's 2022. We already know that burnout and overwork are a huge issue. And even though much of work culture thinks that if we just work hard enough, we'll eventually get ahead, or if we just work hard to put forth more effort, that will always be the correct answer, that will always see us through the problem is just work more, work harder. But actually what we see, and we're starting to understand, is that overwork, especially on a long-term basis, is actually counterproductive for companies in the long run, not to mention individuals. To quote the book, overworked or burned out employees are actually less productive than well-rested workers. They're also less engaged at work. They're more likely to leave. They're even more likely to cut ethical corners or steal from the company. And employee burnout cost the global economy an estimated $300 billion a year in sick days and lost productivity. So even in countries where formal workplace discrimination ended decades ago, long hours make it difficult for women and parents to manage the demands of bosses, professions, and family, and to also maintain their careers after they become parents. So, in addition to that, the Stanford business professor Jeffrey Pfeffer discovered, unsurprisingly, that overworked people also suffer from higher rates of chronic disease and depression. And another study mentioned in the book, quote, a team led by University of California, San Francisco professor Michael Freeman had found that half of entrepreneurs have at least one mental health condition and have significantly higher than normal rates of depression and other issues. Founder burnout is a major factor in 65% of new company failures. I know I can attest to that on a personal level. And if you work for yourself, whether you're an entrepreneur or a freelancer, solopreneur, however that works, I'm sure that that statistic may be not so surprising to you. As someone who has done some spearheading, and I have done and do a lot of work for myself, I often find myself in those statistics. I catch myself inside massive cycles of overwork or burnout, depression, even health issues that arise from stress or get triggered from work-related pressures. So for me, I have this way that I will often fuel that by a sense of like work first. And then when it all gets done, then I get to play and rest or do anything besides work. And while this has given me a very strong sense of discipline in my life, which I'm grateful for, I can get a lot of things done, which is awesome. But the problem with that philosophy is that the work is never done. So unless you're on an academic schedule, we don't really have lives where there's like a clean wrap up where all the work evaporates, deadlines end, homework assignments cease, and everything gets tied up in a pretty little bow while you get a 3-month summer vacation. That doesn't exist for most of us. So how do we work then when there is no end to work? To quote the book, he says, in creative and knowledge-intensive industries, work is never done, no matter how many hours you put in. So overwork is not a sustainable source of a competitive advantage. End quote. I think a lot of us have a sense of like, I'll get ahead if I just put in the extra work now, like this kind of this eternal front loading. But if the work is never done, then we're actually setting ourselves up for this never ending sprint. So for me, the switch has been and is in changing the motivation. Instead of how can I fuel more constant work so that I can work more, the question became, how can I fuel my best work? How can I fuel enduring creativity, which is actually what runs my business and runs a lot of my life? So for knowledge workers, artists, folks whose work relies heavily on their creativity, on their ideas, on their information, their research, their intuition, I think we should all be asking ourselves, how can I caretake my creativity? I think this has also become a really important question, as opposed to how can I constantly achieve more output? So, but at work, there can be all this pressure, to always be present, to make sure people know that you're really working hard, that you always have the best idea. And I think work culture forgets that often our best ideas come from learning. They come from being unproductive or having time to synthesize and play and experiment or try something new. So to quote the book, presenteeism and overwork are particularly toxic in creative industries because they crowd out opportunities for the constant learning and exposure to new ideas, which feed creativity. Pushing back against it requires learning to respect the value of varied experiences and apparently, quote, unproductive time. So that shift really asks us to think more long-term, to think more sustainably about our careers, our ideas, and then the trajectory of our work as a whole. Another quote from the book, in a startup world that values fast burn rates, rocket ship growth, and then always has one eye on the exit, founders who shorten work weeks, they want to create lasting companies. To quote Annie Tevelin, she says, my motivator is to have a good life, to have a business that I'm in control of, that's not growing too much. I'd rather grow my company to something that feels very special 10 years from now than something that's worth $10 million 2 years from now. Put another way, these leaders treat the company as an end in itself, not merely a vehicle for getting rich and famous. So let's look at some of the solutions that a 4-day work week can provide. Can it provide any solutions? How is it working for different companies? So different organizations have gone about reducing their working hours in a lot of different ways. Some folks actually just work 4 full days. So that's 32 hours over the course of 4 days. Another solution, some companies that, who have 4 full company days, and then their 5th day is like a free day where they get to work on personal projects or develop their skills, learn something new, or just focus on creativity. So it's again, valuing that seemingly unproductive time. Other companies have simply kept to working 5 days a week, which is a reduction in hours. For instance, if they're used to working, 80 hours a week, simply holding to actually 40 is a really big adjustment. And then they start to create frameworks that actually penalizes folks for working more than that, which is, a big shift in values. Can you imagine, instead of getting promoted for overworking, you actually lose vacation days instead, which is cool. Other companies, they kept working 5 days a week, but then they simply shortened each day. For instance, getting off at like 2 or 3 p.m. each day instead of 5 p.m. The book Shorter also discusses a lot of the benefits of reducing working hours, and here's some of them that are explored at more depth in the book. One is that it improves performance, which we talked a little bit about earlier. 2 is it improves recruitment, including attracting older and more experienced workers, and then also helping smaller companies attract talent, and it helps them compete with larger companies who might have bigger wallets and more benefits to offer. It decreases turnover, not only because folks stay, because having a shorter work week is such an amazing benefit, but also because the company's hiring process gets a lot more refined. Working parents, it really benefits, particularly women. Not only does it help them achieve more success and income over the course of their life, but then of course they're also able to be better parents. It boosts creativity and happiness, and in turn, it also helps make better leaders. So now we're going to dive into the top 3 things that really stood out to me as far as how working in a 4-day work week differentiates from other modes of working. And the first one is that changing work is social. It's not individual. It is the culture of an organization's team or that has to change. And that's an effort that includes the individual, but it is beyond the individual. So we can't blame a single individual for feeling burned out or overworked. If technically the rules are, you don't have to be available after hours, but the culture is that people do work after hours, and maybe those people are rewarded, promoted, recognized, then regardless of what the rules technically are, the culture says otherwise. And culture is a social endeavor. It's something that we make together. Another key distinction that really stood out to me about this social versus individual identification is that, making sure that we understand that shorter working hours is not the same as flexible working hours. And this is something that I hadn't really put my finger on quite as clearly until I read this book. So shorter work is a collective decision-making process. It's an efficiency upgrade to shorten working hours, which is different than just saying, work whenever you want. Sometimes just get it done, or maybe just some people, if you need it, take it if you need it. With shorter working hours, everyone is given the gift of more work-life balance. People who need more time at home or with their families, or they just want to have a life outside of their job, they can now honor those responsibilities and desires. So the book does a lot to differentiate these, and so I'll offer a small quote from the book. Flexible hours place the burden of scheduling and coordinating with colleagues who are working to different schedules squarely on the individual. Flexible work policies do little to counter presenteeism or the perception among perhaps like maybe unmarried colleagues or people who aren't parents who leave promptly at 5:01. It makes them feel like flexible work doesn't really counter their perception that those people aren't pulling their weight. As many employees will testify, flexible working hours easily morphs from moving working hours to simply working more. Shorter hours, in contrast, succeed through company-wide and normative changes. Not only do parents have more time for children, but everyone has more time. So by encouraging concentration and focused hours, shorter hours diffuse the potential conflicts and organizational challenges that come when colleagues are on different schedules. So this all reminds us that, we judge people based on the current normal. the current normal of this 9 to 5 or this 9 to 9, whatever it looks like. And that begs the question of like, who was the current work week designed for? Are those actually the people who work here? And are those the people that we want to work here? Is it working for them? Does it work for anybody? Who does that working schedule, that working default schedule exclude by the nature of its design? And who does it include? So the way our default work week is designed now makes it seem like, if this doesn't work for you, there's something wrong with you. But really, it's designed for people who might be like 21, don't need to sleep a lot, and don't have a lot of responsibilities besides going to work, But anyone who's got a care work or home life responsibilities, it's not really designed for people who don't have periods. It's not designed for people who experience death or birth or celebrations. It's not designed for people who need a pause of any kind ever or time to digest. It's not designed for people who want to exercise. It's not designed for people who want to take care of their house or have time to recharge. And that's basically most people. So the author goes on to say, by giving everyone more time off, it removes the suspicion and the resentment that otherwise attaches to leaving early. Its egalitarian nature means that, people don't feel obliged to put in extra hours to make up for this like gift of flexible work. It makes work-life balance something that everyone aspires to. There's a problem with only working a fraction of what the other people in the organization work. And that means that for people who want to go part-time, and it's no surprise that a lot of them are women, there is a systemic problem with things like lower lifetime earnings. So from a social justice point of view, just giving people the flexibility to work part-time is not good enough. That's fine from the company's point of view, but for the person who goes part-time, it is more difficult and it has these long-term hidden costs. End quote. So I'm a nerd for many things, including systems and creativity and workflows and PKM and some of the things that don't get included in those kinds of conversations about productivity or creative workflows, et cetera, is acknowledging that sometimes it isn't always your fault that you can't do it all or meet the expectation. Sometimes it's not that you haven't gotten efficient enough or you haven't gotten productive enough. It's that the time expectation doesn't add up, especially if the work life or the work schedule isn't set up to support people who have any of those things I mentioned above, which is mainly a life outside of work or want to have a life outside of work. So in response to a question asked on a radio show that was regarding working mothers, the author said, to put it another way, what I should have said to the radio show callers, and I think this can apply to people beyond working mothers, of course, but it's really honing in on that, like it's not the individual problem. He said, working mothers don't need tips and tricks. They need a workplace and a career model that doesn't expect them to work as if they don't have kids and raise children as if they don't work. Demand that they do both at exactly the same time and then say it's their fault if they can't do that to some poorly articulated impossible standard. They've gotten all the personal advice they need. What they need now is structural change. So we can see that it's not just about changing rules or giving people flexible work options. It's about changing a culture because everyone has to be on board for shorter work to work. It's social. It's not just individual. So if we work on the same team or in the same company, we need to work more efficiently in order to work less. We have to help each other do that. It's not just about one person changing work. So if you need to be able to focus more to get your work done, I have to help you do that by not interrupting you or, reaching out only in agreed upon times. So there's this reminder that our attention is social, our focus is social and cultural. So I would also say that creativity is social, productivity is social. We can only be as productive as our environment allows us to be. So we can only be as creative as our culture enables us to be. And quote the book again, in an age where everyone wants everything now, not bothering people can feel like a gift, to which I, of course, say amen. And think about, in what ways can you help the people around you work better and vice versa? How does the environment support better or shorter work and how does it not? The second point I want to focus on is prioritizing quality over quantity. Obviously, shorter work requires that we work differently and better. So if we're keeping the same standards, but we're shortening the time in which those standards come out, obviously something has to change. If it's not about clocking more hours, then it needs to become about working better hours. And what supports that quality? What mindsets need to change? What habits? What social environments? So the first thing I want to address, which may be obvious by now, but that more hours doesn't necessarily mean better work happens. So the goal of a shorter week is not to cram what you're already doing into a shorter period of time. The goal is, how can the limitation of fewer hours prompt us to work differently? So the same way we approach creating our products, our services, our clients' problems, we can employ that same creativity and design to how we work. So again, not just what we work, but how we do it should get the same kind of attention and focus and design. So to quote the book, while we often regard as separate issues such as work-life balance, burnout, career development, inequality, the future of the high-tech workplace can be approached and managed more holistically. When the author put the same question to Tosh Walker, she starts by saying, I think the first thing is to recognize that it's not about doing 5 days in 4 days. It's not about getting people to work faster. You're trying to think about different ways of working that allow you to work more efficiently so that you don't need the 5th day. End quote. So I think when we figure out how to work better together, we get to take home the benefits in a very tangible way. Everyone reaps the benefits, as opposed to a lot of the time, only the owners or stakeholders of a company get the rewards of anyone doing better work. So here's some small changes that many companies found across the board that support better work. And that includes some of the following: avoiding multitasking and creating intentional periods of deep attention where we agree to not disturb each other or schedule meetings. 2, focus most of your effort on your most valuable work. It feels obvious, but how much of us we realize that wow, all I did today was get through my inbox. That's not your most valuable work, right? So focus on what is your most valuable output. Take quick and purposeful breaks to stretch your muscles, get the blood flowing, and help you synthesize some of the problems you're trying to solve. Again, front loading important work at the beginning of the day, which is when most people have more energy, more ability to focus. And I think even with these 4 things that I've mentioned so far, it's helpful to notice here that a lot of workflows or business expectations, they act like every hour of the day equally supports our best work. But actually, our energy varies throughout the day. So 10 a.m. isn't necessarily interchangeable with 2 p.m. And even just that distinction has really changed a lot about how I make myself available or how I don't. So we are delegating different kinds of work towards the hours of the day that meet our energy and that can already support better work and more focus, even just those things. And then the other 2 are changing meetings, which is a really big thing for people who work with big teams or larger companies. Default meetings, shortening them to 30 instead of 60 minutes, making sure that everyone has an agenda before the meeting so that you're talking about solutions only. You're keeping them more focused. You're having fewer of them. You're making sure that only the people there need to be there, questioning whether or not it actually needs to be a meeting. So it's really about, again, honoring that quality of focus and attention. Is the meeting valuable enough to disturb someone else's best work? And then some others have solved that by just having meetings only on set days or during non-peak focus hours. And then the final common work tweak is that if you use Slack or other chat apps or even emails, only checking them at select times instead of being constantly available to them, which constantly disrupts focus and attention. To quote the book, it's necessary to encourage workers to both take control of their time and to treat their colleagues' time as just as valuable as their own. When you're redesigning the day, people can't just follow business as usual. They need autonomy to experiment, prioritize, and spend their time as effectively as possible. But this control has to be tempered by mutual respect and a recognition that within organizations, time is a collective resource. No one gets to take Friday off unless everyone is done. And everyone's ability to finish their work depends on everyone else's willingness to respect their time. As a leader, you have to move away from thinking in terms of getting the most time out of people, presumably as wringing the most value out of them, and then instead think of getting the most value out of them instead of time, end quote. The third and final point I want to bring up as a foundational shorter work hours thinking is this idea of ownership. We'll start with a quote that says, a 4-day week is a leadership instigated change. But what you really need is for everyone to take ownership of it. As the leader, you open the floodgates and say, right, we're now going to do this. But then you need everyone to find their own rhythm and their own way of embracing it and being really mindful of letting the team develop its own answer, end quote. As me personally, someone who's worked for themselves a lot and managed other teams of people, this struck me as something really important and something I wasn't always able to articulate when I needed to be, is that often workplaces, especially corporate ones or organizations that are really big, they have a culture that's kind of similar to high school, where we're just trying to get through the day, doing the least amount of work necessary to get a good grade, paycheck, and then be able to go home. And a few folks who are super driven or have that innate sense of like ownership or hyper performance tend to rise above the rest via their hustle, or sometimes they get judged culturally as overachievers, maybe they get promoted and or bitter, and then often they become isolated from the rest of the workforce without making any real change to the culture of work overall. But the cool thing that seems to happen when you shorten working hours in a really intentional way across the board, everyone's standard of work can go up. Everyone gets the rewards of working better, and overachieving is no longer required. And in some cases, it's not even allowed. Now we're more focused on cooperation, and it's asking everyone to take more ownership of their work and also how they do their work. And that creates a sense of investment, more value. Instead of just simply waiting to get your homework assignment or counting sheep until the bell rings, there's some motivation to really be a leader of your own workflow and your own output so that we can all reap the rewards of that together. So the book points out that it's not only important for people to find ownership, but to also let employees have ownership during the transition into a shorter week. They need to be given the ability to make decisions and design what their work looks like. So for one thing, they know their job better than their bosses do. And so they know best what could run better, what needs to run differently. They already have a really strong sense of what that is. So if a shorter work week is going to work, that transfer of input needs to happen. Quote, people are more likely to make rules that work for them and to follow the rules that they make. End quote. So to explain this, the book goes in to explain the IKEA effect. And the IKEA effect is essentially this cognitive bias in which people place a higher value on products that they partially created. And so the book explains that people like having autonomy over their work and the control over their environments, and they place greater value on things that they build. Giving people more control over the physical design of their workplaces increases their job satisfaction and productivity. They found that people who got to decorate their own offices felt better about their employers. They said they feel more physically comfortable, they had higher rates of job satisfaction, and were more productive. So it doesn't matter so much, we're talking about decor, we're also talking about workflows and expectations, but just even talking about like the physical design of a space, it didn't really matter so much in the study, like whether, the office looked like Architectural Digest or not. What mattered was having some sort of input and control over the space. That's what really made a difference in productivity. So when we help to make something, we feel more ownership over it, whether those are rules, the design of a space, rhythms, routines, expectations. So we're more invested in it because we helped to build it. This reminds me a lot of Adrienne Maree Brown and her book, Emergent Strategy, where she says, trust the people and they will become trustworthy. And then she also asks us to move at the speed of trust. So sharing ownership, but then also taking ownership. And I think this should apply to work as well. And also, if we find ourselves in a work environment where we can't trust the people, then I think maybe the wrong people got hired or we're in the room with the wrong people. So what does that look like? Often we associate the people in charge as the sort of the leaders or the teachers who are giving us our homework or disciplining us when we do something wrong, rewarding us when we do something good. But what happens when everyone is approaching their work culture like a leader and taking ownership of it? If you're a leader, how can you invite more ownership into the process and share some of that decision making? And if you're an employee, how can you offer more ownership of what you're doing? And what does everyone need in order to do that? So in conclusion, we talked about shorter work as one way to make work better for people and for more people, and some of the things that can help us do that, which are remembering that better work is social and not just individual, valuing quality of work over quantity, focused hours beat long hours. To quote the book, anyone can sit in a chair for 12 hours, and workers who habitually put in long hours need coaching, not awards. Time is valuable, but not all of ours are equally valuable. And then the third thing is to share ownership or to foster an environment of shared ownership. Quote, people are more likely to make the rules that work for them and they follow the rules that they make. So when we change the structure of work, we can create careers and jobs that are more marathons than sprints. And then work then can become something not just for, people who are super young or people who don't sleep or people who don't have kids, but we allow more people into better income, into longer term careers, into more community. Shorter work becomes less about, finding a few star individuals, and it becomes more about investing in people who will take ownership and respect one another and then find ways to work better together. So while there's a lot that we need to change about work and economies, taking a small step, such as shorter, can make really big headway towards making space for even more questions, explorations, making more space for imagination as we seek to make work something that is more human, something that is more open to systems and community and creativity that serve life and one another.